There is a Bible sitting in monasteries, carved into cliffs in the Ethiopian highlands, that contains 22 more books than the one sitting on your shelf. Not lost books, not destroyed books. Books that were simply never let back in, read continuously, copied by hand, guarded for over 1,000 years, in a country most of the Western world barely thought to ask about. This is the story of how that happened, and what those extra pages actually contain. To understand why this Bible exists at all, you have to understand something about Ethiopia that has no parallel anywhere else on the African continent, and very few parallels anywhere else on Earth. Ethiopia was never colonized. While European empires carved up nearly every other nation in Africa, imposing their languages, their institutions, and their versions of Christianity on top of existing cultures, Ethiopia held its ground. Italy tried and failed at the Battle of Adwa in 1896, one of the only times in the era of European imperialism that an African nation defeated a European colonial power outright and kept its sovereignty. That victory mattered for a lot of reasons, but one of the quieter ones is this. It meant nobody came in afterward to tell Ethiopian Christians which books they were allowed to believe in. That single fact changes everything about how this story unfolds. Christianity arrived in Ethiopia extraordinarily early, by most historical accounts, in the 4th century A.D., around the same era it was being formalized in Rome. It didn't arrive through colonization or forced conversion. According to Ethiopian tradition, it came through a shipwrecked Syrian Christian named Frumentius, who ended up serving in the royal court of the Kingdom of Aksum and eventually became the region's first bishop. From that point on, the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church developed largely on its own trajectory, forming its own liturgy, its own theological emphases, and critically, its own biblical canon, built without waiting for approval from Rome or Constantinople. And that canon is enormous. Where most Western Bibles run somewhere between 66 and 73 books, depending on whether you're Protestant or Catholic, the broader Ethiopian Orthodox canon includes 81. The narrower, more standardized version, the one made official under Emperor Haile Selassie in the 20th century, includes 72. Either way, it's the largest biblical canon actively used by any Christian tradition in the world today. Among the additions are books that will sound at least somewhat familiar to Western readers, because they show up as footnotes in academic study Bibles, even if they never made it into the pews. The Book of Jubilees, a retelling of Genesis and Exodus, with additional detail on the calendar and the angels. And the Book of Enoch, probably the most famous of the excluded texts, attributed to the biblical figure who, according to Genesis, walked with God and never died. Enoch describes in vivid and strange detail a rebellion of angels called the Watchers, their intermarriage with human women, the giants born from that union, and a flood sent partly in response to the chaos that followed. It's referenced directly in the New Testament book of Jude, which means the author of Jude clearly knew and respected it, and yet it was left out of a canon that eventually became standard everywhere except Ethiopia. Why did it get left out elsewhere? Historians point to a few overlapping reasons, none of them especially mysterious or conspiratorial. Enoch's imagery was considered theologically risky by some early church authorities. The idea of angels physically intermarrying with humans made a number of influential bishops uncomfortable, and by the 4th and 5th centuries, prominent voices like Augustine were actively arguing against including it. Jubilees, similarly, promoted a 364-day solar calendar that conflicted with the lunisolar calendar most of the Christian world eventually settled on for calculating Easter. These are real theological and administrative disputes, not secret suppressions, but they explain, in ordinary historical terms, why a text could be respected, even quoted, and still not make the final cut. What's remarkable isn't that these books were excluded from the Western canon. Plenty of texts were. What's remarkable is that in Ethiopia, they weren't excluded, they were copied generation after generation, by monks working in some of the most inaccessible places on earth. Take Debre Damo, a monastery perched on top of a flat-top mountain in the Tigray region, reachable only by climbing a rope up a sheer cliff face, a practice that, according to tradition, has been used for over 1,000 years and still excludes women from entering to this day. Or the rock-hewn churches of Lalibela, carved directly downward into solid volcanic rock in the 12th and 13th centuries, an engineering feat that still puzzles people who study it. These weren't just remote for the sake of remoteness. Isolation was survival strategy. Manuscripts stored in accessible lowland cities could be lost to fire, war, looting, or simple decay in a humid climate. Manuscripts stored 1,000 feet up a cliff, guarded by monks who considered every syllable sacred, had a far better chance of surviving 1,000 years. And they were written in a language almost nobody outside Ethiopia could read. Guizi, an ancient liturgical language that functions today roughly the way Latin functions in the Catholic Church, no longer spoken day to day, but preserved specifically for scripture and liturgy. For centuries, that language barrier worked like a second layer of protection. Not only were the texts geographically hard to reach, they were linguistically sealed off from casual Western scholarship. It's only really been over the past century and a half, as Guizi scholarship developed in earnest in European and American universities, that translations of these texts started becoming available to a wider audience at all. One of the scholars most responsible for that shift was Ephraim Isaac, an Ethiopian-born academic who helped found the Department of Afro-American Studies at Harvard and spent much of his career working on Guizi manuscripts, including a widely cited English translation of the Book of Enoch. His work, along with that of other Ethiopianist scholars over the 20th century, is a large part of why these texts are even discussable outside a small circle of specialists today. The broader point scholars in this field tend to make isn't that the Ethiopian canon is secretly the real Bible and everyone else got it wrong. It's that Ethiopia preserved an independent, unbroken strand of very early Christian textual tradition that the rest of Christianity, for a mix of theological and historical reasons, simply didn't retain. That's not a conspiracy. It's a genuinely rare case of a tradition surviving completely intact, because the political conditions that usually erase such things, invasion, forced conversion, colonization, never fully materialize there. So what's actually in these texts that Western Christians have mostly never encountered? The Book of Jubilees positions itself as an expanded retelling of Genesis, delivered to Moses by an angel on Mount Sinai. It adds enormous amounts of detail that the biblical text glosses over. The exact chronology of Adam and Eve's time in Eden, additional stories about Noah's sons dividing the earth, and an insistence on a rigid 364-day calendar that the text argues is the only calendar God actually sanctioned. It reads less like a new revelation and more like an ancient commentary, filling gaps, resolving contradictions, tightening the narrative logic of Genesis for a community that clearly cared a great deal about calendrical precision. The Book of Enoch goes somewhere much stranger. It opens with the fall of the Watchers, angels who, according to the text, descended to earth, took human wives, and taught humanity forbidden knowledge. Weapon-making, cosmetics, sorcery, astrology. Their offspring, giants called the Nephilim, become a source of violence and corruption, so severe that it becomes one of the stated justifications for the flood. The book then shifts into an entirely different mode, following Enoch himself on a guided tour of the cosmos, the storehouses of the winds, the chambers where souls wait after death, the mountain where God will eventually judge the world. It's part myth, part apocalyptic vision, part cosmological travelogue, and it clearly influenced later apocalyptic literature, including parts of the biblical book of Revelation, even though Enoch itself never made the final cut. There's also material in the Ethiopian tradition dealing with the Ark of the Covenant. Ethiopian tradition holds that the Ark itself resides today in a chapel in the city of Aksum, brought there, according to national legend recorded in the medieval text called the Keber Nagast, by Menelik I, the son said to have been born of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. Access to the chapel is restricted to a single monk, chosen to guard it for life, and no one else is permitted inside, a tradition maintained to this day regardless of what outside historians make of the claim. Whether or not you take that literally, it tells you something concrete about how central biblical history is to Ethiopian national identity. This isn't a country with a passing interest in Scripture. It organized entire elements of its statehood and self-understanding around it. None of this means the Western canon is somehow incomplete or that a secret, more authentic Christianity was hidden away and is only now resurfacing. Biblical canon formation, in every tradition, was a human process. Councils, bishops, and communities weighing which texts reflected the faith as they understood it, under real theological disagreements about calendars, angelology, and authorship. The Ethiopian church went through that same kind of process independently and arrived at different conclusions, partly because it had different concerns, different manuscript access, and crucially, no external power dictating the outcome. What makes this story worth telling isn't a hidden prophecy or a suppressed warning about false priests waiting to be decoded. It's something quieter and, in its own way, more impressive. An entire Christian civilization, unconquered for millennia, that took the responsibility of preserving Scripture seriously enough to climb literal cliffs to protect it. Long after most of the ancient world's manuscript collections were burned, looted, or simply crumbled into dust, Ethiopian monks kept copying, by candlelight, in a dead liturgical language, in monasteries perched above the clouds, because they believed every syllable mattered. That's the part of this story that tends to get lost. Not a secret, not a cover-up, just an extraordinary act of patience and devotion, sustained continuously, in one of the only places on earth where nobody ever came along to stop it. Today, scholars continue working through Guizi manuscript collections held in Ethiopia, at the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library in Minnesota, at the Bodleian Library in Oxford, and in a handful of other archives around the world, digitizing and translating texts that in many cases have never been rendered into English at all. Every year, that work opens up a little more of this tradition to people outside Ethiopia who never knew it existed. There's no telling exactly what else is still sitting in those collections, waiting for someone with the right language training and enough patience to sit with it. What is clear is this: the story of the Ethiopian Bible isn't a story about what was hidden from you. It's a story about what one nation refused to let disappear, and about how much of Christian history the rest of the world still has left to learn.